By the time the glass doors sealed behind the last guest, I already knew two things. One, the room smelled like panic dressed in luxury cologne. Two, I was the only person at that table who had actually read every line of the acquisition package. I was 26, Vice President of Strategic Transactions at Arcloom Systems, and the youngest executive in a room built to flatter older men with louder watches. 10 visiting executives sat across from us, representing lenders, board observers, and the founders of Talvin Grid, the energy analytics company we were buying in a deal valued at $1.8 billion. My deck was loaded, the data room was indexed, and the escrow structure had finally stopped trying to behave like a legal prank. Then our chief executive, Ron Dace, decided to perform. He leaned back in his chair, fingers steepled like he had invented gravity. "Before we begin," he said, smiling at the other chiefs, "let us all appreciate Mira for making numbers look pretty enough for grown men to understand." A few polite chuckles bounced around the room. My jaw did not move. I clicked to the first slide. "Purchase price bridge," I said. "The proposed figure assumes Talvin hits the deferred maintenance adjustment and that the customer concentration exposure is ring-fenced through the indemnity cap. If not, the buyer is overpaying for a forecasting engine with a vanity multiple." One of the visiting executives, a silver-haired woman named Liv Kern from a debt fund, gave me the smallest nod. It felt like finding a witness before a storm. Ron cut in. "You hear that? She talks like this all day. Must be exhausting at lunch." More laughter. Sharper this time. I kept going. I was not there to win a charm contest. I was there to keep my company from lighting $1.8 billion on fire and calling it growth. 20 minutes in, we hit the governance section. I explained why Talvin needed a post-closing oversight committee, why founder voting rights had to sunset, and why executive retention bonuses should vest against compliance milestones instead of vibes and handshakes. Ron drummed his fingers on the table. "Mira, hurry up and grab my coffee before it gets cold." The room froze. He did not even look at me when he said it. He looked at the other chief executives, waiting for approval, like sexism was a party trick he had polished for conferences. I said nothing. Ron finally turned. "Well, move." I folded my hands over my notebook. "I am presenting the meeting materials." His smile thinned. Not anymore. It happened so quickly that even the screen behind me seemed embarrassed. Ron stood, straightened his tie, and said, "You are done here, effective immediately. Security can coordinate the rest. I need people in this room who understand hierarchy." No one spoke. Not his general counsel, not the board observer, not the men who had nodded along while I built the deal model they were using to posture. I looked at the recording indicator in the corner of the conference screen. Red light. Active. Our enterprise system recorded major deal meetings for minute marking, diligence callbacks, and approval support. Everyone in that room had consented in writing weeks earlier. Ron had forgotten. I did not remind him. I closed my laptop slowly. I like a woman wrapping crystal before a move. Then I stood. Understood. As I passed behind Liv, she murmured without moving her lips, "Save the file." I nearly laughed. In the hallway, my pulse pounded hard enough to bruise. Humiliation is hot at first. Then it becomes cold and useful. By the time I reached my office, my hands were steady. I copied every version of my approved work product to my personal counsel folder, exactly as permitted under my employment agreement for compensation and dispute purposes. Then I opened the policy manual Ron had never read, the board charter he assumed was decorative, and the side letter tucked into the Talvin term sheet. He had not only insulted me in a recorded meeting. He had fired the transaction lead during a live negotiation, after representations had already been made using my diligent sign-off. In plain English, he had stepped on a legal rake with both feet. I was out of a job by early morning. By midday, I had a plan. People think revenge arrives wearing red lipstick and dramatic music. Mine arrived in a navy binder, a labor attorney, and a spreadsheet so neat it could have testified on its own. By late morning, I was in the office of Sia Voss, a lawyer with a calm voice and the eyes of a woman who could smell fraud through drywall. She listened without interrupting while I laid out the sequence: public humiliation, sex-based remarks, termination in front of outside parties, retaliation risk, deal exposure, recording. When I finished, she slid a yellow pad toward me. Say only what you can prove. Fortunately, you can prove quite a lot. That sentence felt better than tea. We started with employment law. My agreement contained severance protections, a morals clause, and a non-disparagement provision that applied mutually, not just to me. There was also an internal reporting pathway for governance misconduct and discrimination concerns. Ron had bypassed all of it in front of third parties while misrepresenting my role. Bad manners are expensive when signed into policy. Then came the deal issue. I had been the designated internal certifier for diligence completeness in 3 work streams: customer concentration, regulatory exposure, and retention liabilities. Ron had fired me before the meeting concluded, while still using my analysis to support purchase terms. If he continued the transaction without disclosing that disruption, in the buyer side risk statements could be challenged by lenders and the board. If he disclosed it, he would have to explain why he had detonated his own deal captain for sport. Sia smiled for the first time. He picked the worst possible audience. I sent one notice to Human Resources, one to the General Counsel, and one to the independent board chair. No drama, no adjectives, just facts, preserved evidence, and a request for a litigation hold covering the meeting recording, chat logs, prior performance reviews, and transaction communications. I also requested payment of all compensation due, including vested bonus treatment triggered by a change of control process already underway. Then I waited all of 11 minutes before my phone started vibrating. First came Human Resources, suddenly warm and eager, like a snake wearing cashmere. Then the General Counsel, who sounded as if he had swallowed a stapler. Then a message from an executive assistant asking whether I would consider a private conversation with Ron to clear up any misunderstandings. I laughed so hard Sia handed me water. There had been no misunderstanding. A man had confused humiliation with leadership and forgotten the software remembered better than people did. By early afternoon, Liv Kern called from an unknown number. "I am not supposed to do this," she said, "but your termination rattled the lenders. We paused our credit committee. The room trusted your command of the diligence file more than Ron admits." "Wise of you," I said. "Off the record, did he always speak to you like that?" "Only when he had an audience." She exhaled. Noted. That word carried weight. In deals, trust moves faster than money and vanishes even faster. Ron had cracked both. I spent the rest of the afternoon making myself even more dangerous, informed. I mapped every pressure point: board fiduciary duties, disclosure obligations, retaliation claims, defamation exposure, preservation of electronically stored information. I reviewed the real estate annex tied to Talvin's headquarters lease because I remembered a quiet clause about change of control landlord consent. If the wrong officer had signed the certification packet after my exit, the landlord could delay consent and jam closing. Not fatal, but costly. I also reviewed the founder side letters. One founder, Joran Pike, had negotiated a board seat post-closing only if specific integration commitments survived. Ron had already mocked those commitments in internal chats. And if the founders sensed bait and switch, they could demand revised protections or walk. By late afternoon, Sia looked at me across the conference table. "You have 2 choices: quiet settlement or strategic sunlight." I thought of the conference room, the coffee remark, the smug tilt of Ron mouth. The way every man there had stared at the table like courage was billable by the hour. "Sunlight," I said. Then I sent a final email, simple and lethal, requesting that no one use my diligence certifications in any board, lender, or seller materials without written clarification that I had been terminated mid-meeting and was no longer confirming transaction completeness. 10 minutes later, the $1.8 billion deal stopped moving. And somewhere inside Arclume, Rondace finally understood that I had never been the girl who fetched coffee. I had been the woman holding the fuse map. The company tried apology before truth. It is a common executive allergy. By the next morning, I was invited to what they called a reconciliation discussion, which is corporate language for please stop bleeding in the expensive carpet. Sia came with me. She wore charcoal gray and an expression that suggested mercy was available only by appointment. The meeting was in a smaller boardroom, all polished walnut and controlled breathing. Present were the general counsel, the head of human resources, an outside director named Ben Sol, and Ron himself, scrubbed clean and furious that consequences had found his address. He began with the voice menus when they want credit for not shouting. Mira, things became heated. Sia lifted one finger. Do not summarize recorded facts inaccurately. Ben Sol shifted in his seat. Human resources studied a folder that was probably empty. Ron tried again. I was under pressure. I smiled. Then I recommend not firing your transaction lead in front of lenders and counterparties while asking her to fetch coffee. His ears went red. I enjoyed that more than I should admit. They offered salary continuation, a neutral reference, and mutual non-disparagement. In return, they wanted confidentiality, no claim filing, and a signed statement saying my departure had no impact on the Talvin process. That last part was the insult hidden inside the gift basket. It had impact, I said. The lenders paused, the board was alerted, and the seller side now knows your governance is unstable. You are not buying silence. You are leasing fantasy. The outside director looked at Ron the way one looks at a lit candle near drapes. Then Sia unfolded the transcript excerpt. Not the whole recording. Just enough. Ron's joke about grown men, the coffee order, the termination, the silence after. Silence can be evidence too. People forget that. Ben Sol read it once, then again. Was this meeting preserved in our central archive? Yes, said General Counsel very softly. Has the full board heard it? No. Ben turned to Ron. They will. That was the crack. Small, but permanent. I left the room with no deal signed and no settlement reached, which was exactly right. Pressure needs space to build. Outside, I got a message from Joran Pike, one of Talvin's founders. He wanted to talk privately. And we met in the lobby cafe across the street where people pretended not to stare at me. He was younger than I expected, sharp-faced, restless, and suddenly much less impressed by Arclume. I heard what happened, he said. Your board keeps saying the process is intact. It is not, I said. And if you care about your company, do not sign anything based on charisma. Sign based on controls. He smiled at that. You sound like my favorite auditor. I hope she is unpleasant. She is magnificent. For 40 minutes, we talked not as enemies, but as adults who understood that sloppy governance destroys value faster than bad markets do. I explained how earnouts become traps when metrics are vague, why founder rollover equity needs inspection rights, and how indemnity baskets can be weaponized against sellers who are too eager to celebrate. And I did not advise him against the deal. I advised him to stop being dazzled by people who thought legal documents were just decorative napkins. When we stood to leave, he said, Ron told us you handled logistics. I laughed in his face. That was one way to describe preventing executive malpractice. By midday, a rumor began circulating that Talvin was asking for revised governance protections and a direct board session without Ron leading. By afternoon, lenders wanted updated management representations. By late afternoon, 2 independent directors requested an emergency board meeting. And then came my favorite part. A friend from compliance, very careful and very loyal to the law rather than the men who borrowed it, informed me that the meeting archive system logged every playback request. Ron had watched the recording more than once that day. He had also tried, unsuccessfully, to limit access. Too late, because the board chair had already requested a copy. I went home that evening to my little apartment with the bad radiator and the excellent view of a brick wall. I made noodles, took off my heels, and opened my notebook. Revenge is satisfying, precision is divine. Ron was still fighting to keep his chair. But now he had to do it while explaining why the woman he treated like staff had been the only adult protecting his $1.8 billion trophy hunt. The next move belonged to the board, and I knew exactly what they were going to see. The board meeting happened in the early morning haze that makes cities look innocent, which is unfair to cities and dangerous for liars. I was not invited at first. Then I was. Independent directors love process most when it starts protecting them personally. Sia and I arrived to find Arcloom headquarters unusually quiet, as if the building itself hoped nobody would mention yesterday. In the main boardroom, the directors sat in a half circle with tablets, printed binders, and the weary expressions of people who had discovered their chief executive had confused dominance with competence. Ron was there. He looked polished enough to sell confidence to strangers, but his eyes had the shine of a man who had slept badly and blamed furniture. The board chair, Ada Quill, began without pleasantries. We are here to address governance concerns, employment exposure, and transaction risk arising from the Talvin meeting. Then she pressed play. It is one thing to survive humiliation in the moment. It is another to watch the room hear it back in silence. My own voice came through first, calm and precise, walking the table through indemnities and oversight mechanics. Then Ron's voice, amused, reducing me to decoration. Then the coffee order, then the firing. No one moved. When the clip ended, Ada folded her hands. Ron, explain. He tried the pressure excuse again, then humor, then leadership style. Every version sounded worse than the one before, like a man choosing ties in the dark. Ada did not blink. Did you understand the meeting was being recorded? He hesitated. That tiny pause was delicious. Yes. Did you understand Ms. Rowe was the designated diligence certifier for key work streams? Another pause. Operationally, yes. I almost admired the creativity of that nonsense. Ben Sol spoke next. Why were lenders not informed immediately that the transaction lead had been terminated during negotiations? General Counsel answered instead of Ron, which told me everything. That disclosure was not made in real time. Ada turned to me. Ms. Rowe, in your view, what is the present risk? I answered plainly. 3 layers: employment liability from discriminatory conduct and public termination, transaction risk because my diligence role was disrupted without disclosure, governance risk because leadership credibility with lenders and sellers has been damaged. Also, the Talvin side now wants stronger protections, which will cost money. How much? Asked Ada. More than my severance, less than his ego. Ben laughed before catching himself. Ada did not. By the time the discussion shifted to remediation, the room had stopped pretending this was about personality. It was about fiduciary duty, about whether a board could ignore recorded misconduct by the executive steering a major acquisition, about whether investors would trust management that treated one of its own officers like waitstaff during a live negotiation. Then Ada asked the real question. Can this deal close under present leadership? I thought of Liv Kern, Joran Pike, the lenders, the playback logs, the silent men in that conference room. No, I said, not cleanly. That word mattered. Deals can close dirty, they just do not stay quiet afterward. The board called a recess. Sia and I waited in a side room while the city brightened outside. I felt oddly calm, the way I do when I know math has finally cornered arrogance. After a long stretch, Ada returned alone. Ron has been placed on leave pending formal review, she said. The board intends to pursue an emergency leadership transition. We would also like to discuss a resolution of your claims. Does that include correcting the record with counterparties? I asked. Yes. Does it include written acknowledgement that my work was materially relied upon in the Talvin process? Yes. And compensation? Ada gave the faintest smile. Substantial. I leaned back. Good. Then let us be efficient. The settlement took shape quickly once Truth entered the room and closed the door behind it. Severance, accelerated bonus treatment, equity handling, attorney fees, a neutral announcement, no retaliation language, and most importantly, board-level corrections to lenders and the seller side. Before I left, Ada stopped me at the doorway. "One more thing," she said. "Talvin requested you by name for a transition consultation. Apparently they trust your judgment more than ours." I laughed. That seems healthy. Outside, my phone buzzed with one final update. Ron had not resigned gracefully. He had argued, which meant there were witnesses. Perfect. Humiliation had gotten me thrown out of a boardroom. Documentation was about to let me walk back in through a much larger door. By the next week, Rondace was gone. The official statement full of phrases like leadership transition and strategic realignment, which is how companies say escorted out without making legal right letters. I read it over coffee I bought myself, in a cup no one could order me to fetch. Arklum settled with me quietly, but not invisibly. The board corrected the lender package. Neo amended the Talvin disclosure flow and installed interim leadership with the personality of unsalted crackers, which was exactly what the company needed. Boring is underrated after a man has tried turning misogyny into a management style. Then, the delicious part arrived. Talvin did not walk. Instead, they renegotiated. The purchase price adjusted downward, governance protections tightened, founder oversight improved, and executive conduct clauses were added to integration terms. In other words, all the things I had argued for before being treated like office furniture. Arklum saved money by listening too late, which felt close enough to applause. Joran called me from a quiet corner somewhere on his side of the country. "I have a question," he said. "That sounds dangerous already. Would you consider joining us after closing? Not as legal support, as Chief Strategy Officer." I went silent. He filled it with exactly the right sentence. "You were the only person in this circus who understood that deals are not won in the room. They are won in the documents, the incentives, and the power map after everybody shakes hands." I stared out my window at the brick wall that had witnessed my entire professional collapse and recovery. You make disaster sound flattering. I make competence sound employed. I accepted 2 days later. When the deal finally closed, it closed on revised terms built around the protections Ron had mocked. I sat on the Talvin side by then, not as a wounded bystander, but as an executive with a better title, real authority, and a compensation package that made my former severance look like cab fare. At the first joint leadership session, one of the Arklum holdovers asked whether I wanted anything before we began. I smiled. "Just accurate minutes." A few people laughed. The smart ones looked nervous. Good, because what happened to me was never just about one rude man and one ugly meeting. It was about how often capable women are treated like support staff right up until the legal, financial, and strategic consequences become impossible to ignore. People love to underestimate the woman in the room until the room starts collapsing and they realize she was holding half the beams. I did not win because I shouted louder. I won because I knew where risk lived. In recordings, in policies, in board duties, in badly drafted incentives, in the gap between what men say in performance theater and what companies can survive in discovery. Ron had wanted an audience. I gave him one. The board heard him. The lenders heard about him. The sellers priced him. The record preserved him better than memory ever could. And me? I got something sweeter than revenge. I got leverage, dignity, and a larger office at a better company where nobody confused strategic leadership with coffee service. Sometimes women are told to be agreeable, grateful, patient. I have found those words usually come from people standing between you and your own power. I prefer prepared. Prepared women read the contract before the smile. Prepared women save the file. Prepared women know which clauses bite and which promises evaporate. Prepared women do not need the room to respect them immediately. They just need the room to be recorded. And if a man is foolish enough to fire one of us in front of 10 executives during a $1.8 billion deal, he should at least have the courtesy to understand what he is really terminating. Not a job. His advantage.